She didn't even look at the boarding pass. That was the part that stayed with people afterward, the part that made strangers on the internet ball their hands into fists. The flight attendant, a woman named Tara Sims, glanced at the man standing in the first-class aisle, took in his gray sweater, his scuffed carry-on, the quiet way he held himself, and made a decision in under 3 seconds. "Sir, I think there's been a mistake." Her voice carried. Heads turned. "Economy is toward the back." The man, calm, unhurried, the way only certain people can be calm, looked at her and said nothing for a moment. If this story already has your blood moving, hit that subscribe button right now, because we post stories like this every week, and you don't want to miss a single one. Drop a like and tell us in the comments, what city and country are you watching from? I genuinely want to see how far this story travels. Now, let's go back to the beginning. The morning had started the way most mornings at Dallas-Fort Worth started in late October. Gray sky, cold wind cutting across the tarmac, the terminal buzzing with the particular anxiety of people who were already running late or terrified of being late, or both. Gate D22 was packed. The 7:15 to Chicago O'Hare was boarding in stages, and the first-class lane had already thinned out to the last few passengers. Gavin Mercer got in line without fanfare. He was 53 years old, and he had the kind of face that didn't advertise anything. Not wealth, not power, not the particular exhaustion that comes from running a company valued at $11 billion. He had a jaw that needed a shave and eyes the color of old denim. Steady, observant, the kind of eyes that noticed everything and reacted to almost nothing. He was wearing a gray crewneck sweater, the kind you can buy at any mid-range department store, dark slacks with a small coffee stain near the right knee from a cup that had tipped over in his car 2 days ago that he hadn't quite gotten around to dealing with. His carry-on was black, functional, and bore a small dent on the lower corner from the time it had been thrown off a luggage cart at an airport in Munich 3 years prior. He was not dressed like a billionaire. He was not dressed like anything, really. That had always been deliberate. His daughter Maya was 7 years old and had a doctor's appointment on Thursday that he had already moved twice because of work, and he was not going to move it again. That was why he was on a commercial flight to Chicago instead of his company's Gulfstream G700, which was currently being serviced after a hydraulic issue flagged during the previous week's pre-flight inspection. He'd had his assistant, Renata, book him into first class on this route because he had 4 hours of contract documents to review and needed a surface wide enough to spread them out. That was the entire calculation. No performance, no demonstration. Just a man who needed a table and a quiet seat. He handed his boarding pass to the gate agent, a young man with earbuds half in who scanned it without looking up, and walked down the jetway. The plane was an older wide-body, configured in a 2-2 layout up front, the first-class cabin consisting of 12 seats separated from the rest of the aircraft by a thick curtain. Gavin's seat was 3A, window, left side. He had chosen it specifically because the seat beside it, 3B, was listed as unoccupied, which meant he would have room to lay out papers without contorting himself. He found the row, opened the overhead bin, and was in the process of sliding his carry-on into place when he heard footsteps coming up the aisle behind him with a particular kind of purpose. "Excuse me." He turned. She was standing 2 rows back, one of the cabin crew assigned to the first-class section, a woman in her early 40s with dark hair pulled back in a tight bun and a lanyard with her name badge reading Tara Sims, Senior Cabin Crew. Her expression was the expression of someone who had already concluded something and was now in the process of enforcing it. "Can I help you find your seat?" Gavin looked at her. "I have it," he said. 3A. Something shifted in her face. Not doubt exactly. More like the brisk override that happens when someone has already made up their mind and new information is just an obstacle. "Let me just verify that," she said. And she said it in the cheerful, patient tone that is sometimes used with children or elderly people who may be confused. And Gavin registered that tone the way you register weather, noted it, filed it, kept his expression neutral. He reached into his front pocket and produced the boarding pass. Paper, not digital. He'd printed it at the gate because his phone had been at 6% battery when he'd arrived, and he hadn't wanted to risk the screen going dark mid-scan. He held it out toward her. She glanced at it. Not the extended examination of someone verifying a document. A glance. Less than 2 seconds. "And your name, sir?" "Gavin Mercer." She looked at him again. The sweater, the carry-on, the coffee stain. The way he stood in the aisle without the particular brand of casual entitlement that first-class passengers sometimes wore like cologne. "One moment," she said, and turned to the second flight attendant, a man closer to 30 with sharp cheekbones and the name badge Derek Voss, who was standing near the galley. They exchanged something in low voices, and Gavin heard none of it specifically but understood the shape of the conversation from the body language alone. He'd spent 30 years reading rooms. Tara came back. Her smile had returned, but it was the kind of smile applied like a coat of paint over something less agreeable. "Sir, I've been informed that this seat, 3A, was listed under a different booking than what shows on your pass. There may have been a system issue. What we'd like to do is get you settled in a seat in the main cabin while we sort this out with the gate." Gavin looked at her without blinking. "My pass says 3A, he said. "I understand, and I apologize for the confusion," Tara said, smoothly, the apology hitting the air and evaporating before it had any real weight. "But until we can confirm, you haven't scanned it," he said. "The pass. You looked at it, but you didn't scan it." A small pause. A fraction of hesitation. "We'll get this sorted out quickly," she said. "If you'll just follow Derek—" "I'm not going to follow Derek," Gavin said. He said it without heat, without volume, without anything that could reasonably be called hostility. He simply said it the way you state a fact about the weather. "It is raining. I am not going to follow Derek." Derek had materialized at Tara's shoulder now, and the two of them occupied the aisle with the coordinated solidarity of people who had done this before, moved difficult passengers through a combination of politeness and geometric pressure, using their bodies to suggest that the path forward was the one they'd chosen. "Sir," Derek said, his voice lower and carrying a warning in the undertone, "we don't want to make this uncomfortable." "Neither do I," Gavin said, and he almost smiled when he said it. What happened next became one of those things that gets described slightly differently, depending on who's telling it. 2 or 3 passengers in the front rows heard the exchange clearly. A woman in 2B later said that at no point did Gavin raise his voice. A man in 1A said that Tara's expression was one of absolute certainty, the expression of someone who has never seriously questioned their own instincts. What everyone agreed on was that Gavin Mercer, after a moment of quiet that lasted about 5 full seconds, long enough to be felt, picked up his carry-on, took it down from the overhead bin, and walked to the back of the plane. Not because he had accepted their conclusion, but because he had already made a different calculation. He found a middle seat in row 28, 28C, wedged between a large man who had already claimed both armrests and a teenager with noise-canceling headphones who smelled faintly of energy drinks. The seat was narrower than anything his frame was well suited to. There was no tray wide enough for documents. The overhead bin above was full, so his carry-on went 3 rows forward, which meant he couldn't access the contracts anyway. He sat down, folded his hands on his lap, and looked at the seat back in front of him. Then he took out his phone, which Renata had made sure was charged to 100% before he left the car, and dialed a number. The man who answered was named Conrad Bale. He was the head of operations for Mercer Capital Holdings, and he had worked for Gavin for 16 years, which meant he had learned early that when Gavin called in a particular quiet voice, not angry, not excited, just quiet, something was about to shift. "Conrad," Gavin said. "Yeah. I need the G700 on the runway at DFW, not cleared for departure, just on the runway, and I need it there in the next 8 minutes." A silence that lasted 2 heartbeats. "The G700 is in service. Not anymore. Call Marcus. Tell him it's me." A brief pause. "And get me everything you can on the crew assignment for today's United Heartland flight 2247 to Chicago. Specifically, the cabin crew. 2 of them. Woman named Tara Sims and a man named Derek Voss." Conrad did not ask why. He said, "Give me 10 minutes." "You have 8, Gavin said, and hung up. He was still sitting with his hands on his lap. The large man beside him had shifted slightly, instinctively, the way people shift when they sense that the person next to them is carrying some invisible weight. The teenager hadn't moved at all. Up in first class, Tara Sims was moving through the cabin with the efficiency of someone who had resolved a situation and returned to her primary function. She offered warm towels. She offered a pre-departure beverage selection to the passengers in the front rows. She glanced once toward the back of the plane, at nothing in particular, and then returned her attention forward. Derek Voss ran through the safety check in the galley, checked the cart locks, the equipment, the emergency equipment panel. Everything by procedure. Everything in its right place. The pilot, Captain Laurel Haddon, 17 years with the airline, 4,000 hours of total flight time, received final clearance from the tower and began the slow crawl toward the runway. It was 7:22, 7 minutes behind schedule, but recoverable. Chicago was 2 hours and change. She'd flown this route so many times she could recite the waypoints in her sleep. The plane had reached the first taxiway when the tower came back through her headset. United 2247, this is DFW ground. We have a situation on runway 18L. Hold position. Haddon frowned. Ground United 2247. What kind of situation? An unauthorized aircraft has entered runway 18L. We're working on it. Stand by. She looked over at her co-pilot, a man named Felix Tran. He looked back at her. Neither of them said anything because neither of them had anything useful to say yet. She keyed the intercom. Folks, this is Captain Haddon up front. We've been asked to hold our position momentarily while ground operations clear something from the runway. We'll have an update for you shortly. Shouldn't be long. She released the key and added, privately, to no one in particular. I hope. In the cabin, the announcement produced the usual blend of reactions. Passengers shifting in their seats, a few pulling out phones, the collective low-grade tension of people who had connections to make, and schedules that were already precarious. In row 28, Gavin Mercer looked at his watch. 9 minutes had passed since he'd made the call. He allowed himself one small thing that might have been satisfaction. Back in DFW's air traffic control tower, the supervisor on duty, a 20-year veteran named Phyllis Harden, was currently on 3 calls simultaneously, and none of them were going well. The aircraft sitting on runway 18L was a Gulfstream G700 with a tail registration she'd looked up the moment it rolled past the hold line without clearance, and what had come back on that registration had caused her to sit very still for a moment before picking up the first of those 3 phones. The aircraft belonged to Mercer Capital Holdings. She knew the name. Everyone in Texas knew the name if they followed business at all. Mercer Capital owned significant stakes in 17 companies across logistics, tech, real estate, and she double-checked this because she wanted to be sure she wasn't misreading aviation. Specifically, a controlling interest in United Heartland Airlines. The airline whose plane was currently sitting on her taxiway, unable to move because a jet belonging to its own parent company's chairman was blocking its runway. Phyllis Harden put down one phone and picked up another. Get me someone at United Heartland Executive Ops, she said. Right now. The delay was compounding. United 2247 was not the only plane affected. 3 departures behind it had been holding in sequence, and the ripple was spreading outward. Gates backing up, connections starting to look uncertain, the quiet machinery of the airport's timing beginning to grind. In the United Heartland Operations Center at the terminal, a duty manager named Paul Schreiber was trying to understand what he was looking at on his screen when his desk phone rang. He listened for 45 seconds without speaking. Then he said, "Say that again, slowly." The person on the other end said it again, slowly. Schreiber's face went through several phases of expression that could not have been comfortable. He turned to his assistant. Get me Randall right now, and don't tell me he's in a meeting. Tell me to pull him out of whatever meeting he's in." Randall Voss, no relation to Derek, was the vice president of operations for United Heartland Airlines. He was 58, had been with the company for 22 years, and had the particular confidence of a man who had navigated every category of airline crisis and come through with his job intact. When his assistant interrupted his 7:30 briefing with an expression he had never seen on her face before, he knew before she'd finished the sentence that this was something different. He was in the operations center in 6 minutes. He looked at the runway feed, at the registration number, at the passenger manifest for Flight 2247, and at the crew assignment for the same flight. He spent a long time looking at the name in seat 3A, listed as Gavin Mercer, and then the note beside it, passenger relocated, reassigned to 28C. He put his hand flat on the desk and breathed through his nose very carefully. "Who authorized the seat change?" he said. Schreiber told him. 2 names. A senior cabin crew member and a second attendant. Randall Voss absorbed this. "Pull the flight back to the gate," he said quietly. Schreiber blinked. "We have 3 planes backed up on..." "Pull the flight back to the gate." He straightened. He picked up his jacket. "And get me a car. I'm going to the aircraft." Out on the taxiway, Captain Haddon received the instruction from ground control and felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. A low, specific dread that didn't have anything to do with weather or mechanical failure. She'd been told why the runway was blocked. She'd been told who was on her plane. She keyed the intercom again, keeping her voice as steady as she always kept it. "Folks, apologies for the continued delay. Operations has asked us to return to the gate briefly to address a ground issue. I know that's not what anyone wanted to hear this morning, and I do apologize. We'll have more information once we're back at the gate." In first class, Tara Sims stood very still in the galley. She had heard the announcement. She was replaying with perfect clarity every decision she had made in the last 40 minutes, and something cold was moving through her that she was trying very hard not to let show on her face. Derek Voss stood beside her. He didn't say anything either. There was nothing useful to say. In row 28, Gavin Mercer was looking out the window at nothing in particular. The teenager beside him had pulled one side of the headphones off and was trying to figure out what was happening. The large man on the other side had gone quiet in the way large men sometimes go quiet when the atmosphere shifts. "You know what's going on?" the teenager asked, looking at Gavin. Gavin considered the question for a moment. "Some kind of delay," he said simply. "Man," the kid said, and pushed his headphone back over his ear. Gavin looked back out the window. The sky was still gray. The wind was moving the windsock at the end of the nearest taxiway in slow, lazy arcs. He thought about Maya's Thursday appointment, the contracts in his carry-on 3 rows up, the particular quality of silence in a room when something has shifted but no one has said so yet. He was not angry. That was the thing people would have trouble believing later, when the story spread. And it was going to spread because things like this always did. He was not angry. He was something quieter and more considered than anger. Anger was a response. What Gavin Mercer was doing was something closer to a correction. He had been moved from his seat in front of a plane full of people based on nothing more than the way he was dressed. No one had questioned it. Not one person in that first-class cabin had said a word. A man had been displaced from a seat he had paid for, in front of witnesses, and the witnesses had looked away or looked at their phones or simply not registered it as something worth noting. That was the part that stayed with him. Not Tara Sims, not Derek Voss, not the indignity of 37 minutes wedged into 28C. The silence of the room. He'd built his first company at 26 in a rented office with a second-hand desk and a phone that cut out in the rain. He'd lost it at 31 and rebuilt from nothing. He'd raised Maya by himself since she was 3, after her mother had left not for another person or another city, but for a version of herself. She said she'd never found space to become. And he'd understood that, even if it had leveled him for a time. He had learned, through the specific education of loss and recovery, that the world did not self-correct without someone willing to pay the cost of the correction. He was willing. The plane eased back toward the gate, and in a United Heartland operations vehicle making its way across the tarmac, Randall Voss checked his tie in the window's reflection and tried to think of something, anything, that he would be able to say to the man waiting for him. He couldn't come up with much. The jetway made a sound like a held breath releasing when it connected back to the aircraft door. It was 7:51 in the morning, 36 minutes since the plane had pushed back. 36 minutes of delay compounding into the larger delay already accumulating behind it. Gates backed up, passengers checking connections on their phones. The slow-motion chaos that ripples outward from a single point of friction and touches things you never expected it to touch. A woman in row 14 was going to miss her connecting flight to Detroit. A man in row 7 had a presentation in 40 minutes and was trying to figure out if he could join by phone from his seat. 3 flight crew members in the back galley were standing very close together and talking in the kind of low, tight voices that people use when they are frightened but trying not to look it. Tara Sims had not moved from the galley. She was standing with one hand resting on the counter edge, not gripping it, just resting. And her face was arranged in the professional composure she'd spent 15 years building. But her jaw was tight. Derek Voss was beside her, and he'd stopped talking about 5 minutes ago, which was probably the smartest decision he'd made all morning. They knew the plane was back at the gate. They knew something was coming through that door. What they did not know yet, what no one in the cabin had confirmed to them directly, was the specific shape of what they'd walked into. But Tara had made some version of the calculation. She'd seen the operations vehicle on the tarmac as the plane taxied back. She'd seen the door agent's expression when the jetway sealed. She was not a stupid woman. She was a woman who had made a fast decision based on bad information and was now standing in the full consequence of it, trying to hold herself together. The forward cabin door opened. Randall Voss came through first. He was a solidly built man in a charcoal suit that fit him well, the kind of man who has occupied positions of authority long enough that he moves through spaces with an automatic assumption of access. But this morning, the authority was sitting differently on him. There was something effortful about his posture, the particular stiffness of someone keeping themselves very correct because the alternative was visible panic. Behind him came a woman Tara didn't recognize, early 40s, short-cropped hair, in a navy blazer with a United Heartland corporate badge that put her in the legal department. And behind her came two men from airport operations, and then a third man whom Tara also didn't recognize immediately, but who turned out to be from the airline's Human Resources Division, regional level. Captain Haddon had come out of the cockpit and was standing in the narrow space between the galley and the cabin entrance, arms crossed, face unreadable. She looked at Randall when he came through and gave him one brief nod that communicated nothing except acknowledgement of presence. "Where is he?" Randall asked her, low. "Row 28, she said. He looked down the length of the aircraft. From the front of the plane, row 28 was a long way back. The full length of the cabin, past the curtain, past the business zone, past the bulkhead, past the tightly packed rows of coach seats where passengers were now craning to see what was happening at the front. There was a particular quality to the silence in that cabin, the listening quality, the collective held breath of 200 people who understood that something was being decided but didn't know what. Randall straightened his jacket and walked down the aisle. He passed the curtain into economy and kept walking, and every head in every row turned as he went by. He passed row 20, row 24, row 26. In 28C, Gavin Mercer was sitting with his hands folded on his lap, the same position he'd been in since he sat down, looking straight ahead at the seat back in front of him. He did not look up as Randall approached. The man on Gavin's left, the large man who'd claimed both armrests, had pressed himself against the window in a way that suggested he wanted to be significantly further away from whatever this was. The teenager on the right had taken both headphone cups fully off and was watching with undisguised attention. Randall Voss stopped beside row 28 and looked down at Gavin Mercer. "Mr. Mercer," he said. Gavin looked up then. His expression was the same as it had been in the first-class aisle, the same steady, unreactive calm that had apparently read to Tara Sims as vacancy or confusion or simply out-of-placeness, but which, seen now with context, was something else entirely. It was the expression of a man who had nothing to prove and therefore needed to prove nothing. "Mr. Voss," he said. Randall processed that, the fact that Gavin knew his name, and kept his face neutral. "I want to personally apologize for what happened this morning," he said. "On behalf of United Heartland Airlines. What occurred was wrong. You should not have been moved from your seat. You had a valid first-class boarding pass, and you were treated in a way that was completely unacceptable." He paused. "I am deeply sorry." Gavin looked at him for a long moment. "I appreciate that," he said. "But I'd like to stay where I am for now." Randall blinked. "I'm sorry?" "I'd like to stay in this seat," Gavin said. "There are some things I want to address before we talk about moving anywhere." Another pause. Randall glanced briefly at Captain Haddon, who had followed him partway down the aisle and was standing 4 rows back, still with her arms crossed, still unreadable. "Of course," Randall said. He had not planned for this particular configuration. "Whatever you need." "I need the cabin intercom," Gavin said. "I want to speak to everyone on this plane." The teenager beside Gavin let out a breath that was almost a laugh. Not disrespectful, just the involuntary release of someone watching something they hadn't expected. Randall Voss looked at Gavin for a moment longer, and then he straightened and looked at Haddon. She was already reaching for the handset clipped near the overhead panel. She handed it back, person to person, until it reached Gavin. He held it for a moment without pressing the button. Around him, the plane was very quiet. The particular silence that falls when everyone in a space knows that something significant is about to happen, and they don't want to miss it because they were shifting around or digging through their bag. Gavin pressed the button. His voice came through the overhead speakers the way voices do on aircraft intercoms, slightly compressed, slightly close, filling every row from front to back. Good morning, everyone. My name is Gavin Mercer. I'm the man in row 28C, the one in the gray sweater who was asked to move from his first-class seat this morning. I'm going to take about 4 minutes of your time. I know you've already given up more of your morning than you planned, and I'm sorry for that. He paused. In row 2, a woman lowered her phone. In row 15, 2 men looked at each other. In the galley at the front, Tara Sims had her eyes fixed on a fixed point somewhere on the counter surface, and her hand had finally closed into something close to a grip. Most of you were already seated when this happened, Gavin continued. Some of you may have heard it or seen it. A member of the cabin crew looked at me, looked at what I was wearing, decided I didn't belong in first class, and had me moved to this seat without scanning my boarding pass, without verifying my identity, and without any basis beyond how I looked. I had a valid ticket. I had a valid seat assignment. None of that was checked. I was moved because someone looked at me and made a judgment call in about 3 seconds. He let that sit for a moment. I'm not telling you this because I want sympathy. I'm telling you because that kind of thing, that fast, unexamined decision about who belongs where based on how they look, it doesn't just happen on airplanes. It happens in offices and hospitals and courtrooms and everywhere else that 2 people occupy the same space. And it keeps happening partly because most of the time, the people who witness it don't say anything. Not because they're bad people, but because it's not their seat, not their business, because getting involved feels like too much. In row 6, an older man with white hair was sitting very still, listening. In row 19, a young black woman had her hands pressed flat on her knees. I'm the chairman of Mercer Capital Holdings, Gavin said. We're the controlling investor in United Heartland. That's why there's a jet sitting on the runway and why we're all still here. But I want to be very clear about something. The reason I am speaking to you right now has nothing to do with who I am professionally. It has everything to do with the fact that what happened to me this morning happens to people every day, and most of those people don't have a jet they can put on a runway. Most of those people just sit in 28C and eat the cost of it and carry it home without anyone ever knowing. He stopped. His voice had not risen. It had not wavered. It had the steadiness of someone who has thought about what he wants to say long enough that the words have worn smooth. Thank you for your time, he said. I'm going to go speak with the airline now. And if things go the way I intend them to go, everyone on this plane will still get to Chicago today. He handed the intercom back. For a moment, nobody moved. Then the older man in row 6 started clapping. It was not a show. It was the slow, deliberate applause of someone who means it. And after 2 or 3 seconds, other hands joined in, and the sound spread back through the cabin in a wave that was imperfect and genuine, and nothing like the polished kind of moment you'd plan if you were staging a scene. The teenager beside Gavin had both hands going. The large man on his left was nodding slowly, not clapping exactly, but moving in the rhythm of it. In the front galley, Tara Sims heard it all. She turned away from the counter and walked to the small jump seat near the door and sat down in it. Derek Voss looked at her and she looked at him, and neither of them said anything because there was nothing left to manage. Gavin stood, retrieved his carry-on from 3 rows forward, and walked back to the front of the plane. Randall Voss walked beside him, and they did not speak on the way. Randall had been doing this job for 22 years and had navigated investigations, strikes, near misses, 2 fatal incidents, a congressional inquiry, and 4 rounds of labor negotiations. And this was the first time in his professional life that he genuinely did not know how the next 30 minutes were going to go. They came out through the jetway into the gate area where Paul Schreiber was standing with 2 more people from airline operations and a man Gavin recognized as one of his own regional managers, a compact, efficient man named Terrence Yates, who had driven over from the Mercer Capital DFW satellite office in under 20 minutes and was currently standing with a tablet and an expression of someone performing extreme professional calm over extreme personal stress. Terrence gave Gavin a small nod. Gavin acknowledged it. Randall gestured toward a private conference space off the gate area, a small airline operations room used for crew briefings, currently empty. Gavin followed him in, and the woman in the navy blazer from the legal department followed both of them. Schreiber attempted to follow, and Randall gave him a look that stopped him at the door. It was a small room, 2 folding tables pushed together, 6 chairs, a wall-mounted monitor showing the runway camera feed. The G700 was still visible on the runway display, parked calmly, immovably, on runway 18L, its engines dark. 2 airport operations vehicles were parked a cautious distance from it, lights going. Randall sat down. Gavin sat across from him, set his carry-on against the table leg, and folded his hands. "Before we get into specifics," Randall said, "I want you to know that I've already initiated a full operational review. Both employees involved have been temporarily suspended," Gavin said. "Yes, I know. Terrence told me in the hall." Randall stopped, adjusted. "I want to understand what happened," Gavin said. "Walk me through what they told you." "We're still gathering information." "What do you have so far?" Randall looked at the woman beside him, whose name was Abigail Forte, 17 years in airline legal, and she gave him the slight nod of someone who had already assessed that transparency was the only viable strategy in this room. "The crew's account," Randall said carefully, "is that they believed there was a booking discrepancy, that your boarding pass did not match the seat assignment in the system." "My boarding pass was never scanned," Gavin said. "That's correct. It was not." "So the discrepancy they believe they saw it how exactly? By looking at me?" Randall did not answer that immediately. The answer was obvious and sitting in the room like furniture, and answering it out loud meant confirming it officially, which was a different thing. "Mr. Mercer, I'm not asking to make you uncomfortable," Gavin said. "I'm asking because this is the part that matters. The decision they made was not about a booking system. The booking system was the cover story they went to after the fact. The decision was made before any boarding pass was consulted, before any system was checked, based entirely on visual assessment." He paused. "Of me." Randall Voss looked at him for a long time. The clock on the wall, one of those old institutional analog clocks with a red second hand, ticked through 8 seconds. "Yes," Randall said finally. "I believe that's what happened." Abigail Fort wrote something on her notepad. Outside the conference room, the gate area had taken on the quality of a pressurized waiting room. Flight 2247's 200 passengers had deplaned or were in the process of deplaning, and the gate area was loud with the friction of rerouted schedules and frustrated travel plans. Schreiber was on his phone managing 4 things at once. The other 2 operations staff were working through the passenger assistance queue. Terrence Yates stood to one side, watching the door to the conference room. Inside, Gavin leaned back in his chair, not relaxed exactly, but settled. "What I want," he said, "is not complicated. It's 4 things." Randall had a pen in his hand. He hadn't consciously picked it up, but there it was. "Every passenger on Flight 2247 receives a full refund, complimentary rebooking on the next available flight to their destination, and upgraded seating where capacity allows. If anyone needs hotel accommodations because of missed connections, the airline covers those directly. No reimbursement process. No forms to fill out. Covered at point of contact," Randall wrote. His face was the face of a man doing math, but he did not argue. "Second, the 2 crew members, Sims and Voss, are suspended with pay pending a formal investigation. The investigation is not internal only. I want an independent HR review firm brought in. I'll provide 3 names of firms I consider acceptable. You can choose from those or propose an alternative we both agree on. More writing. Third, within 90 days, every cabin crew member in the United Heartland system, not just DFW, not just this route, goes through mandatory in-person bias and customer service training. Not a module, not an online course. In-person, facilitated, with documented completion." He paused. "And the training is not designed to be punitive, it's designed to be useful. There's a difference." Randall looked up from his notepad at that. "And fourth," Gavin said, "new boarding verification procedures. Boarding passes get scanned. Every time. No exceptions, no judgment calls at the door. The system exists. Use it." He stopped. The room was quiet enough that the clock on the wall was audible again. Randall looked at his notepad and then back at Gavin. "The cost on the passenger compensation alone. I'm aware of what it costs," Gavin said. "I also know what the alternative costs. You can run that calculation." He leaned forward slightly. Randall, I'm not here to destroy this airline. I have financial interest in its continued operation. What I'm here to do is make sure that what happened to me this morning is the last time it happens to anyone on a United Heartland aircraft. That is the only outcome I'm interested in." Randall Voss put the pen down. He was a man who had spent 22 years finding ways to absorb impact and protect institutional stability, and he was good at it. But sitting across from Gavin Mercer in this small operations room at 8:19 in the morning, he felt something that wasn't quite common in his professional experience. He felt clearly and without ambiguity that the person across from him was right. Not strategically, not legally, just right. "I'll need to get board sign-off on items 2 and 3, he said. "You'll have it by end of day," Gavin said. "I'll make some calls." That landed with a weight that Abigail Forte noted on her notepad without looking up. Randall picked up his pen again. "The 4th item, the verification procedures. I can implement an interim policy today. Permanent procedure update goes through Ops Committee. 2 weeks, maybe 3. 2 weeks, Gavin said. Not a demand, just a narrowing. 2 weeks, Randall said. They looked at each other across the folding table for a moment that had the quality of something being settled. Not peacefully exactly, but honestly. Two people who understood what the stakes were and had stopped pretending otherwise. "I'd like to go back to the aircraft," Gavin said. "There's something I want to say to the crew." Randall stared at him. "The crew is Mr. Mercer. The employees involved are being escorted off the aircraft as we speak. Given the circumstances..." "Not those two," Gavin said. He stood, picked up his carry-on. "The others. The ones who didn't do anything wrong. They're going to have a rough few days because of this, and none of it is their fault. I'd like to say something to them before I leave." Randall Voss sat for a moment after Gavin walked out. Then he turned to Abigail Fort. She was looking at the door. "Write all of it up," Randall said quietly. Everything he said, word for word. She was already writing. Back in the gate area, Gavin paused near the window that looked out over the tarmac. The G700 was still on the runway, still dark, still immovable. He took out his phone and dialed Conrad. "You can have them clear the runway," he said when Conrad picked up. "Already done," Conrad said. "I was waiting for your call. How'd it go?" "Fine," Gavin said. "Fine like fine, or fine like the other kind of fine?" "The first kind." He watched the G700 begin its slow, careful rollback from the runway surface, the airport operations vehicles moving alongside it. "How's the hydraulic on the 700? "Marcus says a day, maybe 2. "Tell him to take 3 days and do it right." He paused. "Can you call Renata and have her push my 9 o'clock to 10:30? "She already did. She also said, and I'm quoting, 'I told him that sweater was going to be a problem.'" Gavin looked down at the sweater. The coffee stain was still there on his right knee. He almost smiled. "She was wrong about that," he said. He hung up and stood at the window a moment longer, watching the runway clear, watching the ordinary machinery of the airport resume its movement. Gates opening, planes pushing back. The whole complicated business of getting people from one place to another starting up again, as if nothing had interrupted it. In the conference room behind him, Randall Voss was already on his phone to the board, and his voice had that measured, controlled quality of someone delivering news they had already partially processed, which is a different energy than someone delivering a surprise. In the gate area, the passenger assistance line was 3 people deep and moving, the agents working through refunds and rebookings with the particular focused efficiency of people who are very aware that their performance today is being watched by forces above the usual threshold. Tara Sims and Derek Voss were no longer on the aircraft. They had been met at the forward door by an HR representative and asked, politely, specifically, to collect their personal items from the crew areas and surrender their gate access passes. Tara had done this without speaking. Derek had said, at one point, "We didn't know," and the HR representative had looked at him without unkindness and said, "I understand," which was not agreement, and they both knew it. In this cabin, the remaining crew, 4 flight attendants and 2 galley staff who had nothing to do with what happened in that aisle, were going through the aircraft reset process because the plane would fly again today, just under a different schedule. A woman named Rosario, who had been in the back galley all morning and had heard the entire intercom address, was wiping down tray tables in row 22 and doing the disciplined work of keeping herself focused on the task directly in front of her. The door at the front of the aircraft opened, and she looked up. Gavin Mercer walked back down the aisle. He stopped in the middle of the economy section, where the remaining crew members were working, and he didn't make any kind of announcement. He just stopped and waited until each of them had looked up and registered that he was there. "I know none of you were involved in what happened this morning," he said. His voice was quieter without the intercom, the way voices are when they're meant for the people in the room and no one else. "I know you're going to spend a while answering questions about something that wasn't your call and wasn't your mistake. That's not fair, and I'm sorry for it." Rosario had stopped moving the cloth across the tray table. "If anyone gives you trouble because of what happened today," he said, "you have a direct line to my office." He looked around the small half-circle of crew members. "Renata Caldwell, she'll know who you are." He shifted his carry-on his shoulder. "Thank you for your patience this morning." And then he walked back up the aisle and out through the door and down the jetway into the terminal, and the aircraft was quiet behind him in the way that spaces sometimes go quiet after a particular kind of presence leaves, not empty, but aware. Rosario looked at the tray table. She looked at the cloth in her hand. She finished wiping down 22C, moved to 22D, kept working. Outside, at gate D22, the departures board updated. Flight 2247 to Chicago O'Hare rescheduled. The story got out before noon. That was faster than anyone at United Heartland had anticipated, though in retrospect it shouldn't have surprised them. There had been 200 passengers on that plane, each carrying a phone, each sitting in their seat listening to a man speak plainly about what had been done to him, and the math on that was simple. By 10 a.m., 3 separate accounts had been posted on social media. One from the teenager in 28D, whose name turned out to be Jordan Kessler, 17 years old, flying alone to visit his older brother at Northwestern, and who had posted a 40-second video from his seat that showed nothing except the back of Gavin's head during the intercom address and the sound of the applause afterward. The video had 60,000 views before Jordan had even landed on the rebooked flight. By noon, it had 400,000. By mid-afternoon, it had crossed a threshold that the social media team at United Heartland's communications department described, in a conference call, as non-recoverable from an organic suppression standpoint, which was their way of saying the story was now larger than anything they could quietly manage. Gavin knew none of this until Renata told him. He'd made it to Chicago on the rebooked 10:45 flight. Different aircraft, uneventful, his first-class seat confirmed and uncontested, and was in a glass-walled conference room on the 31st floor of a building on West Monroe Street by 11:15, working through the contract documents he'd originally planned to review on the plane. He'd gotten through most of them by the time Renata appeared in the doorway with the expression she wore when something required his attention that was not on his schedule. Renata Caldwell had been his executive assistant for 11 years. She was 51, precise, had a graduate degree in organizational management that she used every single day, and she communicated complex information in the fewest possible words because she'd worked for Gavin long enough to know that he processed faster when given the core facts and room to think, rather than a full narrative and a prepackaged conclusion. She said, "The DFW incident is on social media. Video, 400,000 views as of 20 minutes ago. It's moving." Gavin looked up from the contracts. "Which part?" "Your intercom address. You can't see your face clearly, but you can hear everything." She paused. "Jordan Kessler, 17, seat 28D. He says in his caption that he watched you get moved to the back and that he didn't say anything and that he's been thinking about that all morning." Gavin was quiet for a moment. "Is he okay?" Renata blinked. In 11 years, that was not the first question she'd expected. "He's fine. He's trending. His brother picked him up from O'Hare an hour ago." She paused again. "The communications teams at both the Airline and Mercer Capital are asking what you'd like them to say." "Tell ours to say nothing," Gavin said. "No statement, no comment, no acknowledgement." He looked back down at the contract page in front of him, then back up. "Tell Randall Voss the same. Anything United Heartland puts out right now in response to the video looks reactive. Better to let it move on its own for a day and then address it through action rather than words. He may not agree. He doesn't need to agree. He needs to not make it worse." Gavin paused. "Tell him that last part more diplomatically." Renata's expression did not change, but something in it indicated she appreciated the clarification. She left, and the door eased shut behind her, and Gavin sat for a moment with the contract document in front of him and did not immediately read it. He was thinking about Jordan Kessler, Specifically, the thing Renata had said. He says he watched you get moved to the back and that he didn't say anything and that he's been thinking about it all morning. 17 years old, sitting in 28D with noise-canceling headphones, watching an adult get displaced from a seat he'd paid for, and staying quiet because what were you supposed to do? Because it wasn't your seat, and it wasn't your situation, and adults handled things among themselves. And anyway, the flight attendants were the authority, and you didn't second-guess the authority when you were 17 and flying alone. Gavin understood that. He'd been 17 once, though not in a way that felt particularly recent anymore. He'd been quiet in moments he should have spoken, and he'd spoken in moments he should have considered more carefully, and the balance of those decisions had never fully resolved itself into something he was at peace with. He'd learned that most people's silences weren't cruelty. They were calculation. The fast, unconscious math of risk versus involvement. The determination that whatever was happening was probably not as serious as it looked. That someone else with more authority or more connection was better positioned to handle it. That stepping in would cost something and the outcome was uncertain. He picked up the contract. He got back to work. At Dallas-Fort Worth, it was a different kind of afternoon. The United Heartland Operations Center at the terminal had settled from the acute crisis of the morning into the sustained, grinding effort of managing its aftermath. Schreiber had been on calls continuously since 8 a.m. and had eaten half a granola bar over his keyboard at some point around 10:30. The passenger compensation process was moving, slower than Randall had promised Gavin, because nothing of that scale moves fast, but moving. Refunds were being issued. Rebookings had been managed, most of them before noon. 7 passengers had needed hotel accommodations for missed connections, and those had been arranged and confirmed by 11 a.m., which was the one part of the morning's commitments that had gone cleanly. The independent HR review firm, Gavin's office, had sent 3 names at 9:47 a.m., faster than anyone expected, had received a call from Abigail Fort in legal by 10:15. A firm called Hartwell Meridian, the second name on Gavin's list, had confirmed availability to begin a preliminary assessment within 48 hours. The paperwork was being drafted. Tara Sims had gone home, or rather she had driven to the parking garage, sat in her car for 22 minutes without starting the engine, and then driven home. She lived in a house in Grapevine, 20 minutes from the airport, that she shared with her husband, Dale, who worked in infrastructure project management, and their 2 kids, a son in middle school and a daughter in 4th grade. Dale's car was in the driveway when she pulled in, which meant he was working from home today, which meant she was going to have to explain this before she'd had time to figure out how she felt about it herself. She sat in the driveway for a moment, hands on the wheel. The thing she kept coming back to was not the image of Randall Voss walking down the aircraft aisle toward row 28. It was not the applause. It was the 3 seconds in the first-class aisle when she'd looked at the man in the gray sweater and made a determination, and the particular quality of certainty she'd felt in that moment. A certainty so complete she hadn't thought of it as a judgment at all. It had felt like observation, like simply seeing what was there. She had been wrong. That part was clear, and she was not trying to avoid it. She had been wrong, and she had compounded the wrongness by not scanning the boarding pass, and she had compounded it further by enlisting Derek, and she had done all of this in full view of a cabin of passengers and within earshot of people who were now posting about it on the internet, and the shape of the damage was still too large for her to fully see from where she was standing. What she was struggling with, the part she could not make clean and simple even now, was the question of intent. She had not set out to humiliate anyone. She had not acted out of malice exactly. She had acted out of something more ordinary and in some ways more difficult to argue with. A fast read of a situation based on pattern recognition. The same kind of fast read she used dozens of times a day in a job that required constant, split-second assessment of people and circumstances. She had been doing it for 15 years. It had served her well, mostly. Except this time, the pattern she'd recognized hadn't been a pattern. It had been an assumption. And the difference between those 2 things, between seeing clearly and seeing what you expect to see, was something she was going to be sitting with for a long time. She got out of the car. She went inside. Dale was at the kitchen table with his laptop. He looked up. He already had an expression that told her he'd seen something. Probably his phone, probably a headline. "Hey," he said carefully. "Hey," she said. A pause. "I saw," he started. I know, she said. Can you give me 20 minutes before we talk about it? He looked at her for a moment and then said, Yeah, of course. And he turned back to his laptop and she went upstairs, and she sat on the edge of the bed in the quiet of the afternoon and stayed there. Derek Voss had a different afternoon. He lived alone in an apartment in Irving, and he'd spent the first hour after getting home calling his union rep, a man named Carl Stein, who had answered on the second ring and listened to the whole story with the focused attention of someone taking mental notes, which he was. Carl was 55, had been a union rep for 19 years, and had handled a lot of things. And when Derek finished talking, Carl said, Okay, don't post anything, don't respond to anything, don't reach out to anyone at the airline or to Mercer Capital. Let me handle the communication. What do you think is going to happen? Derek asked. Carl was quiet for a moment. Honestly, I think it depends on how the investigation comes out and what the chairman decides he wants. Right now he's holding all the cards. He paused. You said you didn't scan the boarding pass either. Tara said there was a discrepancy. Right, but you didn't independently verify. You just backed her up. Derek didn't say anything. That's going to be relevant, Carl said, not unkindly. Just something to think about. Derek had been thinking about it. He'd been thinking about the specific moment in the galley when Tara had turned to him and said, low and quick, The guy in 3A. I don't think he belongs up here. And Derek had looked at the man, taken the same 3-second inventory of gray sweater, scuffed bag, quiet posture, and said, Yeah, okay, before he'd finished the thought. He hadn't asked why, hadn't asked what the system showed, had just agreed, the way you agree with a senior colleague when you're the junior person on the crew, and the math of that dynamic is always operating whether you consciously engage it or not. He was the junior person on the crew. That was true. But he also had eyes and a boarding scanner that he had not used, and those were also true. And the space between those two truths was where his responsibility lived, and he knew it. He put his phone down and looked at the wall for a while. Back in Chicago, the 31st floor conference room had mostly cleared by 3 p.m. The contract work was done, or done enough for today, which was a different thing, but the difference was manageable. Gavin had a call with his Chicago-based board liaison at 3:15, a real estate fund review at 4, and then nothing until a dinner he'd scheduled with a former colleague who was in town from Seattle, which he was already considering canceling. The 3:15 call ended up being about the DFW situation, not the Chicago agenda. His board liaison, a woman named Frances Cho, who had been on the Mercer Capital board for 9 years, had seen the social media coverage and had questions. Frances was the kind of person who asked questions in the form of statements, which Gavin had always found efficient. You made 4 demands and Randall agreed to all of them, she said. I made 4 requests, Gavin said. He agreed. The passenger compensation is going to run close to, I know what it's going to run. The board is going to want context before they sign off on the investigation scope. The board will have a full briefing from me tomorrow morning, Gavin said. 9 a.m. Chicago time. I'll do it by video if I'm not back by then. Are you planning to take legal action? No? Frances was quiet for a moment. Gavin, the public coverage alone. Frances. He paused. I don't need the legal system to fix what happened this morning. I need the airline to fix what happened this morning. Those are different instruments for different problems. He shifted the phone. The board will get their briefing. Tell them to hold on anything formal until then. All right, she said. She had been doing this long enough to recognize when he had considered a thing fully. The dinner tonight with Marcus Whitfield. Cancel it. Tell Marcus I'll reach out next week when I'm back. Already done, she said. Renata told me at 2. He looked at the phone for a moment. Of course she did, he said. He hung up and sat in the quiet of the now empty conference room. The Chicago skyline was visible through the floor-to-ceiling glass, gray sky, Lake Michigan flat, and dark on the horizon. The city going about its late afternoon business without any particular awareness that anything significant was happening. That was always the thing about scale. From up here, in a glass box on floor 31, the city looked like a model of itself, and it was easy to forget that each of those windows held a person with a full set of circumstances that were entirely serious to them and invisible from here. He thought about Maya's Thursday appointment. She had a thing about waiting rooms, had had it since she was 4 or 5, some specific anxiety about the combination of the particular smell and the chairs that were too big for her, and the way time moved differently when you were waiting for something that might be bad news. He'd learned to bring a specific small bag for those appointments: crayons, a sketchbook, 2 juice boxes, a bag of the pretzel nuggets she liked, and he'd learned to sit on the floor with her in the corner rather than in the waiting room chairs, because the floor felt more like a choice and less like something that was being done to you. He was going to be there Thursday. That was not changing. At 4:17 p.m. Central Time, United Heartland Airlines issued a public statement. It was 11 sentences, which was shorter than their communications director had wanted and longer than their legal team had recommended, and it had been reviewed by Randall Voss, Abigail Forte, and 3 other people before it went out. It said that the airline took full responsibility for the events of that morning, that the employees involved had been suspended pending independent investigation, that all affected passengers had been or were in the process of being compensated, and that the airline was committed to mandatory training and new verification procedures for its entire cabin crew. It did not name Gavin Mercer, at his specific request, conveyed through Renata to Abigail Forte at 1:45 p.m. It also, at Randall's own insistence, did not use the word regrettable, which Abigail had noted was a legal hedge word that everyone now recognized as a legal hedge word, and which would read, in the current environment, as exactly what it was. The statement got more coverage than the video, by a factor of roughly 3. By 6 p.m., United Heartland Airlines had a trending hashtag. By 7 p.m., 2 cable news programs had run segments. A travel industry publication ran a piece in which 3 anonymous airline industry sources noted that the level of passenger compensation being offered was extraordinary by any benchmark, and that the independent review process was uncommon and notably aggressive for an internal conduct matter, both of which were accurate. A business publication ran a separate piece focused on Gavin Mercer and the ways in which the incident revealed what their headline called the extraordinary and largely invisible nature of inherited corporate power structures, a piece that Gavin read on his phone in the back of a car headed to his hotel and found simultaneously flattering, reductive, and about 40% accurate, which was roughly his baseline expectation for business journalism. Jordan Kessler, in the meantime, had given 3 interviews by phone from his brother's apartment in Evanston. Each one asked him a variation of the same question: why he'd said in his original post that he hadn't spoken up and had been thinking about it all morning. In each interview, he gave a slightly different version of the same answer, which was that he didn't know exactly, that it had felt like it wasn't his place, that the flight attendants seemed sure of themselves and he was just a kid, but that hearing the man on the intercom say what he said, specifically the part about how it keeps happening because people who witness it don't say anything, had made something click into place that he was still figuring out how to articulate. The third interviewer, a woman who hosted a podcast on social accountability, pushed him a little. "Do you think you would act differently if it happened again?" Jordan thought about it for an honest moment, which the podcast host noted afterward was unusually refreshing. "I'd like to think I would," he said, but I think the point he was making was that it's easy to know what you'd do in theory. The test is the actual moment. He paused. "I didn't do great on the actual moment," he said, "but I guess I know that now." The podcast host would later say that that was the clip she replayed most often when she thought about the episode. In Grapevine, at 7:30 in the evening, Tara Sims came downstairs and sat across from Dale at the kitchen table. The kids were in their rooms. The news segment was over. She'd heard it playing from upstairs but hadn't watched it. Dale had made coffee, which was his way of handling things that needed handling, and there were 2 cups on the table. She picked hers up. "I wasn't trying to humiliate him," she said. "I know that," Dale said. "I made a call that I thought was—" She stopped, started again. "I looked at him, and I made a decision about what I saw. And I was wrong. And now—" She gestured vaguely at the phone on the table, at the world beyond the window, at the general weight of consequence pressing in from multiple directions. "Now it's this." Dale looked at her steadily. He was a patient man, not in the passive sense, but in the sense of someone who had learned that most things that needed to be said could be said better after a moment than in the immediate reaction to them. "Were you wrong?" he asked. "Yes," she said without hesitation. "I was wrong. Obviously I was wrong. Do you know why?" She looked at her coffee cup. "I thought I was seeing a problem and I was solving it. That's the job usually. You see something off, and you address it before it becomes a situation. Except the thing I thought was off wasn't off. It didn't match what I expected. She paused. That's the thing I keep turning over. I had 15 years of experience telling me I was making a good call. And 15 years of experience is apparently not a defense against seeing exactly what you want to see. Dale said nothing, because there was nothing to add to that. What happens now? She asked. Investigation, he said. Union will handle the process. Carl said, I know what Carl said. She put the cup down. I mean after. Whatever the investigation finds, whatever happens with the job, what happens to... She stopped again. She was not a woman who lost words easily, but tonight words were not coming in the shapes she needed them. I did that. On an airplane, in front of 100 people. I did that. Yeah, Dale said. You did. She nodded. That was what she needed from him, actually. Not comfort, not defense, not the reframing of events that would make the thing smaller than it was. She needed him to say it plainly so that it was real, and not something she could argue herself away from. Okay, she said. She picked up her coffee again. Outside the window, the street was quiet. A car moved slowly past under the sodium vapor lights, turning carefully at the corner. The neighborhood was doing what neighborhoods do at 7:30 on a weekday evening, going about the regular business of people winding down, settling into whatever the evening held, the day becoming the past in small, continuous increments. At 31 floors above the Chicago street, Gavin Mercer was in his hotel room. He'd ordered room service, soup, a sandwich, an order of fries that arrived slightly cold but that he ate anyway, and was sitting at the desk with his phone in his hand, not doing anything with it in particular. He called Maya at 8 o'clock. She answered on the second ring, the way she always did, as if she'd been sitting near the phone waiting for it. She was with Mrs. Abernathy, the neighbor who stayed with her when Gavin traveled. A retired woman of 70 who had grandchildren she saw 4 times a year, and who treated Maya's existence as a reasonable interim substitute, which Gavin was perpetually grateful for in a quiet, ongoing way. Hi, Dad, Maya said. Hey, Bug, how was school? Okay, we did fractions. I don't like fractions. Nobody likes fractions, he said. They grow on you. That's what you said about broccoli. Broccoli is excellent. It's terrible, she said firmly. He smiled. It was the realest thing his face had done all day. How's Mrs. Abernathy? She's watching her show. Can you hear it? She moved the phone, and in the background he could hear the particular volume of television that people of Mrs. Abernathy's generation preferred, which was turned up past the point of apology. I can hear it, he said. What time are you coming home? Tomorrow afternoon, maybe evening, but Thursday. I'll be home Thursday. Your appointment's at 2, so we'll leave at 1:30. Are you going to bring the pretzel things? Already packed, he said. This was not true yet, but it would be by Thursday morning. Okay, she said. She was quiet for a moment, and in the background the television changed to something with a louder musical cue. Dad? Yeah. Mrs. Abernathy showed me a video on the news tonight. Was that your plane? He paused. He'd wondered how long it would take for it to reach her. It was, he said. The lady made you sit in the back? She did. That's mean, Maya said. He thought about how to answer that. He thought about 15 years of professional experience and fast pattern recognition and the vast, complicated human machinery of assumption and conclusion and all the ways people sort the world into what makes sense to them and what doesn't. It wasn't the best decision, he said carefully. Sometimes people make decisions without enough information. It doesn't always mean they're mean. Sometimes they're just not thinking as carefully as they should be. Maya processed this for a moment. But it was wrong, she said. Yes, he said. It was wrong. And you fixed it? He looked at the wall of the hotel room, at the bad abstract print above the desk, at his carry-on on the luggage rack, still with the dent from the Munich airport incident 3 years ago, the coffee-stained slacks hanging over the chair. Working on it, he said. Okay, she said, satisfied by this, in the way that 7-year-olds can be satisfied by partial answers when the tone of them is honest. Mrs. Abernathy says hi. Tell her hi back. Good night, Dad. Good night, Bug. He set the phone down on the desk. The fries were cold. The soup was finished. Outside the window, the city was doing what it did, carrying itself forward into the evening, indifferent and enormous, and full of people none of whom knew or needed to know that a man in a gray sweater was sitting at a hotel desk on floor 17 thinking about fractions and broccoli and the specific, imperfect weight of trying to do something right in a world that mostly makes it harder than it should be. He finished the cold fries. He opened his laptop. He had a board briefing to prepare for 9 a.m., and it was not going to write itself. The board briefing ran 47 minutes, which was longer than Gavin had planned and shorter than Francis Cho had expected. He did it by video from the hotel room, sitting at the same desk where he'd worked until past midnight on the presentation, the Chicago skyline visible through the window behind him in the flat gray light of early morning. There were 11 people on the call, 8 board members, Francis, Abigail Fort dialing in from DFW, and Terrence Yates, who had been included at Gavin's specific request because Terrence had been on the ground at the airport and Gavin wanted at least one person in the room who could answer operational questions from direct observation rather than secondhand summary. It had happened. No editorializing, no strategic framing, no prepackaging of how they should feel about it. Just the sequence. Boarding pass, aisle, the conversation with Tara Sims, the walk to row 28, the phone call, the runway, the return to the gate, the operations room, the 4 requests, Randall's agreement on all of them. When he finished, nobody spoke for a moment. Then a board member named Gerald Sutton, who was 71, had been on the Mercer Capital Board for 14 years, and had the particular patience of someone who had watched many crises arrive and depart, said, "You put a jet on a runway." "I did," Gavin said, "an occupied runway." The runway was clear at the time the jet entered it. Marcus confirmed with the tower that there was a gap in the departure sequence. The jet was never in the path of an active aircraft. Gerald considered this, but it was enough to hold the flight. That was the intent, yes. Another brief silence. Gerald said, "All right," in the tone of a man who had filed a thing under a category and closed the drawer. Francis spoke next. "The compensation package Randall agreed to, we're looking at the full cost coming in around—" "I've seen the projection," Gavin said. "It's within operating parameters for an event of this scope. It's not comfortable, but it's manageable, and it's the right number." The independent investigation firm told Hartwell Meridian. "They're solid. I've used them twice before on portfolio company matters. They're thorough, and they're not friendly to either side, which is exactly what this situation requires." A board member named Sandra Leith, who ran her own consulting practice and had joined the board 3 years ago, leaned toward her camera. "Gavin, what's your read on the public situation? The coverage is still moving. We're seeing opinion pieces this morning that are getting into the broader pattern of bias in service industries, that's a bigger conversation than a single flight." "It is," he said, "and it should be. That's not something we can or should try to contain. The coverage will do what it does. Our job is to make sure that what United Heartland actually does in the next 60 to 90 days is substantive enough that when the coverage eventually looks back at this, the story isn't Airline apologized and moved on. The story should be Airline changed something real." Sandra nodded slowly. "And you believe Randall Voss is the person to deliver that?" It wasn't entirely a question. Gavin took a moment with it. "Randall is a good operations executive. He's not a culture change person by instinct, but he's competent, and he's motivated right now in ways that I think will be productive. We'll have the Hartwell findings in 4 to 6 weeks. If those findings suggest that the problem is deeper or more systemic than a 2-person failure, we'll revisit the leadership question. But I don't want to make that call before we have the data." This answer landed the way careful answers land, with the particular weight of someone who has thought past the obvious move to the 1-2 steps further. The call wrapped at 9:49. Francis stayed on after the others dropped off, and for a moment it was just the two of them on a video screen which had a different quality than the full group. Less performance, more conversation. "You doing okay?" she asked. He looked at her. Francis Cho was not someone who asked that question casually. She asked it when she meant it and expected an honest answer. "I'm fine," he said. "I was in a middle seat for less than an hour. I've had worse mornings." "That's not what I'm asking about." He understood. She was asking about the larger thing, about what it costs to be the kind of person who sees something wrong and does something about it, and about whether the cost was sitting on him in ways that didn't show clearly from the outside. "It stays with you a little," he said finally. "The intercom address. Standing up there in front of 200 people. He paused. I've given presentations to rooms of 500. I've testified before a Senate subcommittee. I don't get nervous in professional settings anymore. But standing in that aisle, talking into a phone handset, there was a moment where I wasn't sure I was going to be able to say what I wanted to say the way I wanted to say it. But you did, Frances said. I got through it, he said, which was different from what she'd said, and she noticed the difference, and she let it be. Thursday is Maya's appointment? She asked. 2:00. You'll be home by then. I'll be home by then, he said. She nodded. Good briefing, Gavin. Get some breakfast. And she ended the call. He sat for a moment at the desk. The laptop screen went dark. Outside, the gray sky had lightened slightly. Not sunny exactly, but the particular winter light gray of a city that had decided to be functional rather than beautiful today, which was fine. He could work with functional. He ordered breakfast from room service and got in the shower, and while he was in the shower, he thought about Tara Sims in the way that he'd been thinking about her periodically since yesterday. Not with anger, which continued to be true and which still surprised some people when they learned it, but with the particular uncomfortable complexity of someone trying to understand another person's failure without excusing it. He'd done a version of what she did. Not in the same context, not with the same stakes, but he'd done it. Made fast calls based on incomplete data and been wrong. He'd misjudged a business partner at 34, and it had cost him a contract worth 8 months of operating capital. He'd read a market signal wrong at 40 and restructured a fund in a direction that took 2 years to correct. He'd read his own marriage wrong for the last year of it, telling himself it was a phase, a workable thing, something that would stabilize. Until the morning his ex-wife had sat across from him at the kitchen table and said quietly and without accusation that she had not been herself in 7 years and she needed to find out who she was before there was nothing left of her to find. He'd been wrong. He'd acted on bad pattern recognition. The difference between those situations and 3A on Flight 2247 was the nature of what was being misread. In his cases, circumstances. In Tara's case, a person. A specific human being standing in an aisle with a valid ticket, being sorted by sight into a category of people who didn't belong. That distinction mattered. It was the distinction that made what happened correctable for him and less clear for her. Because misreading a market or a contract or even a marriage was a failure of analysis. But misreading a person based on their appearance in a way that publicly displaced them was a different category of failure, one that touched something that didn't untouch easily. He stood under the water until it started to cool, and then he got out. By the time breakfast arrived, he had 3 messages from Renata. The first was a logistics update. His return flight to Dallas was confirmed for 4:15 p.m., which would get him home by early evening. The second was a note that Hartwell Meridian had formally accepted the engagement and that their preliminary assessment timeline had been confirmed at 45 days. The third was a forwarded email from Randall Voss, sent at 7:22 a.m. that morning, which Renata had flagged with the single annotation, "You should read this one." He opened it. Randall had written it himself. That was evident from the first sentence, which was slightly awkward in the way of a man who is accustomed to having communications drafted for him, but has decided this particular thing should come from him directly. It was 7 paragraphs. In it, Randall described his morning, not the professional morning, not the crisis management, but the personal version. He'd gotten home the previous night at 9:30. His wife, Patricia, had been awake, had watched the news coverage, and had been sitting at the kitchen table when he came in with 2 cups of tea that had gone cold while she waited. She asked me if I was okay, Randall had written. I told her I was handling it. She said that wasn't what she asked. We sat at the table for an hour and a half. She asked me what I would have done if I'd been the man in 28C. I didn't have a good answer. I've been in operations for 22 years, and I think I've spent a lot of that time managing outcomes rather than thinking about the people inside them. Yesterday It was a bad day, but I think it might also have been a necessary one. I wanted to say that to you directly, not through a statement or a legal instrument. You didn't have to handle this the way you did. You could have made it much more expensive for us, and I think most people in your position would have. The fact that you didn't, I don't know what to do with that except to try to deserve it. Gavin read it twice. Then he set his phone down, picked up the coffee that had come with breakfast, and drank it, and the coffee was too hot and slightly over-extracted, and he drank it anyway. He wrote back 3 sentences. Thank you for this. I appreciate you writing it yourself. Let's make the next part worth the cost of the first part. He sent it before he had the chance to revise it into something more careful, which was probably the right instinct. At Dallas-Fort Worth, the investigation was officially underway. The Hartwell Meridian team, 2 senior investigators and 1 documentation specialist, arrived at the United Heartland Operations Center at 10 a.m. for their preliminary intake meeting. They met with Abigail Forte and the airline's head of human resources, a woman named Constance Briggs, who had been with the company for 12 years and who had spent the previous day reviewing every piece of documentation connected to the morning's crew assignment, boarding records, and terminal communications. The investigators were thorough in the way of people who have done this many times in many industries and have learned that the difference between a useful investigation and a performative one is whether you're actually willing to find what's there, as opposed to finding what confirms the most convenient narrative. The lead investigator, a man named David Parr, 60 years old, former federal employment attorney, had made it clear in the preliminary call with Abigail that Hartwell would go where the evidence pointed, that their report would reflect what they found rather than what anyone on either side hoped they'd find, and that if anyone attempted to direct the investigation toward a predetermined conclusion, he would note that in the report. Abigail had said, "Understood," and meant it. What emerged in the first day of intake was a picture more complicated than the initial 2-person narrative. It was not that Tara Sims and Derek Voss were outliers, people who had acted in a way categorically different from their peers. The boarding records going back 18 months showed 14 documented instances of passengers being manually redirected from confirmed seat assignments without scanner verification across multiple crews, multiple routes, multiple airports. Not all of them involved bias. Some involved genuine system errors that hadn't been properly followed up on. But several involved circumstances similar enough to the DFW incident to be relevant. Passengers moved from premium cabins based on crew judgment, the scanner not used, no formal documentation filed afterward. The pattern was not loud. It was quiet, and it had been quiet for long enough that it had calcified into something resembling normal practice. David Parr looked at the boarding records spread across the conference table and said to his colleague, a woman named Harriet Sohn, "How long do you think this has been ambient?" Harriet, who was 54 and had spent 20 years doing exactly this kind of institutional archaeology, said, "Long enough that nobody in that crew thought twice about it." "Which means the training gap isn't just bias," he said. "The training gap is procedure," she said. "The bias is a symptom. The procedure gap is the system." Parr wrote something in his notebook and circled it twice. Constance Briggs, sitting across the table, was watching this exchange with the expression of someone who suspected this was where the findings were heading and was working through the implications. This was not going to be a 2-person disciplinary outcome. This was going to be a systemic report, and a systemic report required systemic remedies, and systemic remedies required organizational will at a level that disciplinary action did not. She picked up her phone and sent a message to Randall Voss. "Going to need 20 minutes with you this afternoon. Not urgent, but it matters." Randall replied in 4 minutes. 4 o'clock. My office. While the investigation was taking shape at DFW, something else was happening at a smaller scale in places that the investigation and the media coverage and the boardroom conversations would not touch directly. The private, individual reckonings of people who had been on the plane. The woman from row 14, the one who'd missed her connection to Detroit, had been rebooked and arrived at her destination by early afternoon. Her name was Claudette Marsh, and she was 58, a speech pathologist who had been traveling for a professional conference. She'd heard the entire intercom address from her seat and had written about it that evening in the journal she'd been keeping since her 50s, a practice her therapist had recommended and that she'd initially resisted and now couldn't imagine not having. She wrote 3 pages, which was more than she usually wrote in a single sitting. And most of what she wrote was not about Gavin Mercer or Tara Sims or the airline. Most of it was about a moment 11 years ago in a hospital corridor when she'd watched a colleague speak dismissively to an elderly black patient and had not said anything, had told herself it wasn't her place, that it would create friction, that the patient hadn't seemed bothered, and had carried that moment in the low, persistent way of something unfinished. She wrote about whether that silence and the silence of the first-class cabin were the same kind of thing, and about what it would have cost her to speak in either case, and about why the calculation had come out the way it did. She didn't reach a clean conclusion because there wasn't one available. but she wrote it down. That was the thing she could do. The man in row 6, the older man with white hair who had started the applause, was named Frederick Amato, and he was 69, retired, flying to Chicago to visit his daughter and son-in-law, and 3 grandchildren he saw 4 times a year. He was a quiet man by nature, not given to public gestures, and the applause had surprised him as much as anyone. It had started in his hands before he'd made a conscious decision about it, which was how he explained it to his daughter that evening when she asked. She'd seen the video. His hands were in the edge of the frame for about 2 seconds. "Why did you start clapping?" she asked. He thought about it for a moment, the way he thought about things, carefully, without rushing. "Because somebody needed to," he said, "and I was there." She looked at him for a moment. He was her father, and she had known him for 41 years, and she could not think of another situation in which he had described his own actions that simply and that accurately. "More coffee?" she asked. "Please," he said. Back in Irving, Derek Voss had spent the better part of Wednesday doing the thing Carl had told him to do. Nothing. And finding it harder than expected. Not because he wanted to act, but because the suspension meant he had a full day with nothing to fill it except his own thoughts, which were not comfortable company right now. He called his mother in the early afternoon. She lived in Beaumont, 250 miles away, and she was 72 and sharp and had raised 3 kids largely alone after his father left when Derek was 9, and she did not allow him to be vague with her. "Tell me what happened," she said when he called. He told her. All of it. She listened without interrupting, which was how she listened when she was taking something seriously. When he finished, she said, "Did you think the man belonged in first class?" He paused. "No," he said. "Why not?" He paused again, longer. "He didn't look like he did." "What does that mean?" And here was the thing. When his mother asked the question, with that particular directness, the answer he'd given himself all day. Tara said there was a discrepancy, and I was following the senior crew member's lead, and I was doing my job, fell apart, and left something smaller and less comfortable behind it. He'd looked at the man. He'd taken a fast reading. He'd agreed before he'd finished the thought. "I don't know," he said, which was the most honest thing he'd said about it. "Yes, you do," his mother said. He was quiet. "You know," she said, "your grandfather used to say that the most dangerous thing a person can do is confuse their assumptions with their eyes, because your eyes are right there in your head with all your assumptions, and they don't know the difference." She paused. "You made a mistake, a bad one, but you didn't make it out of cruelty. You made it out of not thinking, which is different, and which means you have room to do better." Another pause. "But you have to actually do better. You understand?" "Yes, ma'am," he said. "Good. Have you eaten today?" "Not really." "Derek?" "I'll eat something." "Call me tomorrow," she said. "I want to know you're okay." "I'll call you tomorrow." He made a sandwich after he hung up. He ate it standing at the kitchen counter, looking at nothing in particular. It was not a good sandwich. He'd forgotten to buy bread recently and was using the heel pieces, and the mustard was almost empty. But he ate it, and then he washed the plate, and then he sat down on the couch and tried to figure out what kind of person he was going to be on the other side of this, which was a question he hadn't expected to be asking himself on a Wednesday afternoon in October, and which he did not have an answer for yet, but which, for the first time today, felt like a question worth sitting with rather than one he needed to escape. Tara Sims received a call from Carl Stein at 3 in the afternoon. He told her that the investigation scope had expanded, that Hartwell Meridian's preliminary intake had surfaced a pattern of non-compliance with boarding verification procedures that went beyond the 2 of them, across multiple crews and routes. He explained what that meant for the disciplinary process. It was likely to shift the framing from individual misconduct to systemic failure, which was legally different and procedurally different, and in terms of outcome, potentially different as well. "Does that help us?" she asked. Carl was honest with her. "It changes the context. It doesn't change what you did." "I wasn't asking it to," she said. A pause on Carl's end. "The training program Mercer is requiring," he said. "Mandatory, in person, for all cabin crew. The union has reviewed the initial parameters. We're not objecting. The structure looks like it was designed to actually help people, rather than to punish them publicly. Whoever put the curriculum parameters together knew what they were doing." Tara thought about that. Does Mercer know that the problem is bigger than us? She asked. His office has been briefed on the Hartwell preliminary intake. Yes. And? His response, as relayed through Abigail Forte, was, "That's why we needed the investigation." She sat with that for a moment. It was not forgiveness. She wasn't looking for forgiveness from a man she'd never properly spoken to, and she understood that what had happened was not the kind of thing that resolved through forgiveness anyway. It resolved through what happened next, what people did with it, what changed. "Thank you, Carl," she said. "Call me if you hear anything before I do," he said. "And Tara, eat something. Sleep if you can. This is going to take a while, and you need to be functional for it." "Okay," she said. She put the phone down. Through the window of the living room, she could see the backyard. The old playset her son had mostly outgrown, her daughter's bike leaning against the fence, the ordinary late afternoon stillness of a suburban yard in October. Nothing had changed out there. The same fence, the same grass, the same light coming in at the same angle it came in every afternoon at this time of year. But something had changed in the way she was looking at it. She couldn't have fully articulated the difference. It was more like a shift in the quality of attention, the way a room changes when you've moved a piece of furniture. Everything's still where it was, but the proportions slightly altered, the sight lines different. She'd been wrong. She knew that. She was not going to spend the rest of her life in the sackcloth of it. That wasn't useful to anyone, least of all to her kids, who needed her functional and present, not folded in on herself with guilt. But she was also not going to paper over it with explanation and procedure and the deflection of systemic context, because the systemic context was real, and also she had specifically stood in that aisle with a boarding pass. She had not scanned, and a certainty she had not earned. She went to the kitchen and started making dinner. Something simple, pasta, jarred sauce, a salad she would dress from the bottle because nobody in this house ate homemade dressing except her, and it wasn't worth making a full batch. Her son came down the stairs at 5, dropped his backpack in the corner, opened the refrigerator. "What are we having?" he said. "Pasta." "Cool." He got out the orange juice, poured a glass, leaned against the counter. He was 12, and he had the particular 12-year-old quality of being almost constantly in motion even when standing still. "Mom?" "Yeah." "I saw the thing online about the flight." She kept stirring the sauce. "I know you did. Kids at school were talking about it." A pause. "Are you in trouble?" She turned to look at him. He was trying to look casual and not entirely succeeding, which was how she knew he was actually asking something serious. "I am," she said. "Yeah." He nodded. He processed. He drank some orange juice. "Did you know he was rich?" he asked. "No," she said. "I didn't." Would it have mattered? She looked at him, at her 12-year-old son, asking her a question she suspected he already knew the answer to, in the way that kids sometimes already know the answer when they ask. "It shouldn't have," she said. "It shouldn't have mattered either way. That's the point." He nodded again, slowly. Put the juice back in the refrigerator, picked up his backpack. "Okay," he said, and went back upstairs. She turned back to the stove. The sauce was starting to bubble. She turned down the heat, put the lid on, set the timer, and stood there in the kitchen while the window above the sink showed the backyard going gray in the early dark. And she let the day be what it was, imperfect, unfinished, heavy in specific ways she'd have to carry forward. That was the part nobody could take from you, and nobody could carry for you. The weight was yours. You just had to decide what you did with it. At 4:15 that afternoon, Gavin Mercer boarded Flight 1318 at O'Hare, bound for Dallas-Fort Worth. His seat was 2A, first class left side window. He settled in, set his carry-on in the overhead bin, sat down. The seat next to him, 2B, was empty, which meant he had room to work. He had the contract documents out before the boarding door had closed, the pages organized the way he'd organized them the night before. The annotations in the margins in his own handwriting, which was neither neat nor illegible, but somewhere in the functional middle. The flight attendant came by, a young woman who looked like she was in her mid-20s, first or second year in the job, with a name badge that read Simone. She offered the pre-departure beverage with a polite efficiency that was clearly learned and slightly self-conscious, the way things are when you're still assembling the professional persona that will eventually fit without effort. "Water would be great," Gavin said. "Thank you." She brought it back 2 minutes later without the slight awkwardness this time. Smoother, the small repetition of the task having settled her a notch. She moved up the aisle to the next row. Gavin watched her go, briefly, then looked back at his documents. The plane pushed back from the gate at 4:29. The sky over Chicago was the same flat gray it had been all day, and the lights of the city were beginning to come on in the early dark below as the aircraft climbed. He worked for the first hour of the flight without looking up. The contracts, the annotations, the slow, deliberate work of reading something carefully rather than fast because the difference mattered, and he'd learned that the hard way. Somewhere over Missouri, he put the papers down and looked out the window. Below, the grid of a city, he wasn't sure which one, didn't check the map, was spread out in the dark, the lights orderly from this height in a way they never are at ground level, where the same lights are traffic and storefronts and porch lights, and all the accumulated electricity of people going about their lives in real time, full of friction and decision and consequence. He thought about Maya's pretzel bag. He'd need to stop somewhere before Thursday. He thought about Randall's email. I don't know what to do with that, except to try to deserve it. He'd meant what he wrote back. The next part had to be worth the cost of the first part. That was the only math that made any of it worthwhile. He thought about Jordan Kessler in 28D, who'd had his headphones half off and been thinking about it all morning. 17, alone on a flight, watching an adult get displaced and not knowing whether the moment required him to speak. Learning something on a Tuesday in October that most people didn't get the particular focused opportunity to learn. That the test is the actual moment, not the version of it you construct afterward in the safety of hindsight. He hoped the kid gave himself some room with it. 17 was not too late to learn. Neither was 42 or 58 or 72. None of those ages were too late. That was the thing worth holding on to. The plane descended into Dallas at 6:44 p.m., right on schedule. I was home by 7:30. Mrs. Abernathy had left a pot of soup on the stove, chicken, the kind with egg noodles, and too much dill that Gavin had never particularly liked and had never said anything about because the gesture behind it was worth more than the seasoning. Maya was still awake, technically past her bedtime, but operating on the particular logic of children who understand that a returning parent is a reasonable exception to the usual rules. She was on the couch in her pajamas with a sketchbook open on her lap when he came through the door, and she looked up at him with the specific expression she'd had since she was 3 years old. Not quite a smile yet, just the recognition, the recalibration of the room now that he was in it. "You made it," she said. "I made it," he said. He dropped his carry-on by the stairs, hung up his jacket, sat down on the couch beside her. She leaned into him without ceremony, the way small children lean, not performing affection, just locating the nearest solid thing and settling against it. He looked at what she'd been drawing. It was an airplane, a large commercial plane with windows, and below it, a smaller jet on what appeared to be a runway, and below that, a figure in what was unmistakably a gray sweater standing very straight. He looked at it for a moment. "That's quite accurate," he said. "I looked it up online," she said. "Someone made a cartoon of it." He made a mental note to look that up later, then made a second mental note that he probably shouldn't, that some things were better encountered gradually. "Bedtime," he said. 5 more minutes. 3. She considered the negotiation and accepted it, which told him she'd already been pushing past bedtime for a while, and 3 minutes was still a net win. He sat with her while she finished the drawing, adding clouds above the plane, which she drew as lumpy, irregular shapes rather than the idealized puffs of children's books, and which looked, because of that, more like actual clouds than most cloud drawings he'd seen. He tucked her in at 8:15. She was asleep before he'd finished closing the door. He went back downstairs, poured the soup into a bowl, even though he wasn't particularly hungry, and sat at the kitchen table, the same table where he'd eaten 1,000 dinners, where he'd spread contracts and read reports, and helped Maya with homework that had progressively shifted from tracing letters to long division to the early stages of fractions, which she did not like, and which, as he'd told her, grew on you. He ate the soup. It had too much dill. He finished it anyway. Then he took out his phone and read through the messages he'd been managing at a distance all day. Renata had flagged 12 items, of which 4 required responses before morning. He worked through those in order, carefully, without rushing, the way you do when you're tired, but the work still has to be right. There was a message from Conrad with an update on the G700, Marcus had found a secondary issue with the hydraulic system during the repair, which was good that they'd caught it and bad that it added another day to the timeline. There was a message from Francis with a brief note that the board had formally authorized the Hartwell engagement and the training program scope, both of which he'd expected but which needed to be on record. There was a message from Terrence Yates with a logistics summary from DFW. The passenger compensation process was 91% complete, with 6 outstanding cases requiring individual follow-up, all of which were expected to resolve by end of week. And there was a message he had not expected, a short one, from an address he didn't recognize, which Renata had forwarded without annotation, which meant she'd decided it was his call, whether to engage with it. It was from Rosario, the flight attendant from the back galley of Flight 2247, who had been wiping down tray tables in row 22 when he'd walked back through the cabin Wednesday morning. "Mr. Mercer," it said, "I got your assistance information from a colleague who found it through the company directory. I wanted to say thank you, not for the offer of help, though I appreciate it, but for coming back into the cabin to say what you said to us. You didn't have to do that. It was a hard morning, and that made it less hard, and I've been thinking about it ever since. I hope your week gets better from here. Rosario Vega." He read it twice. Then he set the phone down on the table and sat with it for a moment, the soup bowl empty in front of him, the kitchen quiet, the night outside the window ordinary and dark. He wrote back 5 sentences. He thanked her for writing. He said the flight crew's patience that morning had made a difficult situation more manageable than it could have been. He said he meant what he'd offered, that Renata's line was real and open, not a formality. He said he hoped her week was better too. He sent it. Then he went to bed. He slept better than he'd expected to. The Hartwell Meridian report came in on the 43rd day, 2 days ahead of the projected timeline, which David Parr mentioned in passing when he delivered it. The way people mention things that reflect well on them without technically taking credit. It was 68 pages, including appendices, and it was exactly what Harriet Sohn had predicted in the conference room on the first day of intake. Not a 2-person story, but a systemic one. The report documented 19 instances of boarding verification non-compliance over an 18-month period across 7 different crew assignments on United Heartland routes operating out of 4 airports. It found that the failure to use the electronic boarding scanner as the primary verification instrument was not an outlier behavior, but a normalized one. Something that had evolved over time through a combination of inadequate supervision, unclear enforcement standards, and a training program that addressed the procedure in theory without monitoring it in practice. The report noted that bias, explicit or implicit, could not be ruled out as a contributing factor in some of the documented cases, but that the procedural failure was significant enough on its own to represent a systemic risk independent of bias. Because a system that allows crew members to make boarding decisions through personal judgment rather than verified data is a system that creates conditions for exactly the kind of failure that had occurred on Flight 2247. The report made 9 recommendations. Gavin read all of them on a Sunday afternoon, alone in his home office while Maya was next door at a friend's birthday party, and he read them the way he read everything that mattered, slowly, with a pencil in his hand, making small marks in the margin where something needed to be held or questioned. 7 of the 9 recommendations aligned with what he'd already asked of Randall. The 8th was a recommendation he hadn't specifically required but immediately agreed with, a formal anonymous reporting mechanism for cabin crew to flag verification compliance issues without going through their direct supervisors, since the data showed that several of the documented non-compliance instances had been witnessed by other crew members who had not reported them through official channels. The 9th recommendation was the one he sat with longest. It called for the airline to create what the report described as a dignity baseline standard, a formally codified set of passenger treatment principles, distinct from existing service protocols, that established a floor of conduct independent of passenger class, appearance, or perceived status. The report noted that United Heartland, like most airlines, had extensive standards governing the quality of service offered to premium passengers, but no comparable standard establishing the non-negotiable minimum of respect owed to every passenger regardless of where they were sitting. The distinction, the report argued, was not semantic. A service standard told crew members what to offer. A dignity standard told them what was never acceptable to withhold. Gavin set the pencil down. He called Randall. I just finished the report, he said when Randall picked up. So did I, Randall said. He sounded the way a man sounds when he's been sitting with something heavy and is not sure how to begin talking about it. The 19th instance was on a route out of Charlotte. March, 18 months ago. The passenger filed an informal complaint that never made it past the gate supervisor. He paused. I didn't know about it. Would you have known? Gavin asked. A silence. Probably not. The reporting structure wasn't built to surface that kind of thing. It was built to surface safety issues and customer service failures, and somehow, he stopped. Somehow this didn't fit neatly into either category, so it didn't go anywhere. Recommendation 8 fixes that, Gavin said. I know, I've already talked to Constance about implementation. Another pause. What did you think about number 9? I think it's the right call, Gavin said, and I think it needs to come from the top, not from a policy committee. The board should adopt it formally, and you should announce it yourself, publicly, with the investigation findings. That's going to require, I know what it requires. I'll walk the board through it this week. He paused. Randall, this is the part that matters. The investigation and the compensation, those were corrections. This is the part where you build something that didn't exist before. That's different work. Randall was quiet for a long moment. You know, he said finally, when this started, I thought the worst of it was going to be the financial exposure, the compensation, the investigation costs, the potential legal liability if you decided to go that route. He paused. The actual hardest part has been reading a 68-page report that describes a problem that existed in my airline, on my watch, for 18 months, that I didn't see because I wasn't looking for it. Gavin listened. My wife asked me the other night, Randall continued, whether I thought I was a good leader. I told her I thought I was an effective one. She asked if I thought those were the same thing. He stopped. I've been thinking about that. What did you tell her? I told her I wasn't sure they were, Randall said, and that I was going to try to find out. Gavin looked out his office window at the backyard where the afternoon light was doing the particular thing it did in late November, coming in low and golden and sideways, the kind of light that makes ordinary objects look more themselves than usual, as if the angle is stripping away everything incidental and leaving just the core of what things are. The oak tree in the back corner of the yard, the wooden bench he kept meaning to repaint, the side gate that needed a new latch. That's the right answer, he said. The announcement came on a Thursday, 6 weeks after the morning at gate D22, which was, though nobody planned it that way, the same day as Maya's rescheduled doctor's appointment. United Heartland Airlines published its full public statement at 9 a.m. Central Time. It was 3 pages, which was long for a corporate statement, and deliberately so. Randall had insisted, over the communications director's objection, that the full Hartwell findings be summarized honestly rather than euphemized, and that the 9 recommendations and the airline's formal commitments against each one be stated specifically rather than bundled into vague language about ongoing commitment to excellence. The Dignity Baseline Standard was the centerpiece of the announcement, and it was written in plain English rather than policy language, which had required 4 drafts and 2 arguments, and had ultimately come out the way it needed to because Randall had taken the 4th draft home to Patricia, asked her to read it, and used her questions as the editing instrument. Patricia Voss, it turned out, had a very good ear for when language was doing the work of honesty and when it was doing the work of self-protection. The statement also confirmed that the mandatory in-person training program would begin rolling out across all United Heartland crew assignments in the first quarter of the new year, starting with DFW and expanding system-wide over 6 months. The curriculum had been developed by an external organizational development firm with specific expertise in workplace bias and procedural compliance. Not the same kind of firm that did checkbox diversity trainings, but people who built programs designed to actually change how individuals made decisions in real-time situations. The public response to the announcement was different from the response to the original incident. The incident had produced the heat of outrage, fast, bright, driven by the immediate injustice of the image and the satisfying specificity of the villain and hero dynamic that social media was well designed to amplify. The announcement produced something slower and more uncertain because accountability without punishment was a harder thing for people to know what to do with. There were those who felt the 2 suspended employees should face harsher consequences, and those who felt the systemic framing was being used to dilute individual responsibility, and those who thought the dignity standard was a genuinely meaningful development, and those who were skeptical of any corporate policy that had been produced under the pressure of a PR crisis rather than from genuine internal will. All of those reactions were legitimate. None of them were fully wrong. That was the nature of things that were actually complicated, as opposed to things that merely looked complicated from a distance. Tara Sims read the statement on her phone at 10:15 that morning, sitting in her car in the parking lot of a grocery store where she'd stopped on the way back from a meeting with Carl Stein and Abigail Forte that had lasted 2.5 hours. The meeting had concluded with an agreement, not a legal settlement, not a dismissal, but a structured return-to-work arrangement contingent on completion of the full training program and a supervised 6-month period with documented performance review. It was not a clean outcome. It was the kind of outcome that had conditions attached and would require ongoing effort and would not feel resolved for a long time, possibly ever. She'd sat in Carl's office for a moment after Abigail left, and he'd asked her how she felt. Tired, she said, and I don't know. Like something is different, and I can't tell yet if different means better. It usually takes a while to tell, Carl said. How long? Depends on what you do with it. She'd driven to the grocery store because she needed milk and bread, and the Tuesday through Friday structure of a person who had places to be had briefly deserted her. She sat in the parking lot and read the statement. She read the section about the dignity baseline standard twice. She read the part that said, in plain language, that every passenger, regardless of how they arrived, regardless of what they were wearing, regardless of every variable that had nothing to do with their valid ticket and their valid seat, was entitled to be treated with a baseline of respect that no crew member's judgment call could override. She thought about the man in the gray sweater, about the 3 seconds in which she'd looked at him and decided what she saw. She thought about her son asking her, at the kitchen counter with his orange juice, whether it would have mattered if she'd known he was rich. And about her own answer, that it shouldn't have mattered either way. That was the point. The point had cost her something real, her equanimity, her certainty about her own professional instincts, a stretch of weeks that she would not remember fondly. It had also given her something she was still figuring out how to carry, a clearer view of the specific way her assumptions had been operating inside her without her full knowledge for a long time, in the confident disguise of experience. She was going to go back to work. She was going to do the training, not as a box to check, but as a genuine attempt to understand something she hadn't understood before. She was going to be supervised, and she was going to be evaluated, and she was not going to pretend any of that was comfortable, because it wasn't. But she was also not going to be destroyed by it. She was 43 years old, and she had kids to raise and a job she'd built over 15 years, and a husband who sat across from her at the kitchen table and told her the hard thing plainly because that was what she needed, and those were the structures of a life. And a life didn't stop because one morning went badly wrong. She started the car. She went inside and bought the milk and the bread. She called Dale from the produce section to ask if they needed anything else, because that was a Tuesday thing to do. And Tuesday was still happening, whether or not everything else had resolved. Derek Voss received his return-to-work agreement on the same day, through Carl, with similar terms. He read it at his kitchen table. A real meal this time, eggs and toast, something he'd made himself. And he sat with it for a while before he picked up the phone to call his mother. She answered on the second ring. "Tell me," she said. He told her. When he finished, she said, "Good, that's fair, fair." "It doesn't feel totally fair," he said. "I mean, it does, but it also feels like a lot." "It is a lot," she said. "Fair doesn't mean easy." He thought about that. "No," he said. "I guess it doesn't." "What are you going to do with it?" He looked at the agreement on the table. The terms, the timeline, the conditions. All the specifics of a path back into a job he'd been doing for 6 years and would be doing differently, if he did it right, on the other side of this. "I'm going to do it right," he said. "Good," she said. "That's all I needed to hear." A pause. "Did you eat?" "I'm eating right now." "Good boy," she said, and hung up. He looked at the eggs. He finished them. They were a little overcooked because he'd been on the phone, but they were fine. On a Friday morning in December, 6 weeks and 4 days after the morning at Gate D22, Gavin Mercer arrived at Dallas-Fort Worth Airport at 6:50 a.m. He was taking the 7:15 to Chicago again. Same route, different day. He had a meeting at the Chicago office at 11, the quarterly fund review, the kind of meeting that required him to be physically present because there were documents to sign and a new portfolio company's founders to meet in person, because some things were still better done in a room. The G700 was back in service and fully cleared, but he'd had Renata book the commercial flight 2 weeks ago, before the G700 was confirmed ready, and he'd kept the booking because there was no particular reason not to. He walked through the terminal in the gray sweater. Same one. It was clean, obviously, had been washed 4 or 5 times since October, but the same sweater. He'd thought about that briefly when he'd gotten dressed that morning, the choice of it, and had decided it was not a statement and also not nothing, and that was fine. A man wore what he wore. He went through security. He stopped at a coffee cart and bought a large black coffee from a young man who was learning the machinery, slightly too slow with the portafilter, watching it the way you watch something you're still building muscle memory for, and tipped him well without making a thing of it. He found gate D22. It was the same gate which he had not arranged and which was, as far as he could tell, simply what it was. The departures board showed the same flight number, the same destination, the same departure time. The gate area was filling up with the usual composition of early morning travelers, business people, families, a few college students, an older couple with matching carry-ons who appeared to be heading somewhere exciting based on the quiet pleasure in how they were sitting together. He got in the boarding line when the first-class lane opened. The gate agent this morning was a woman he didn't recognize, not the young man with the half-in earbuds from October. She was efficient, mid-40s, the practiced smoothness of someone who had been doing this long enough that it required almost no conscious attention. She reached for his boarding pass, paper again. He'd printed it at the kiosk, and scanned it. The scanner beeped. Green. Thank you, Mr. Mercer. Welcome aboard. He walked down the jetway. He found 3A. Same seat, left side, window. The overhead bin was empty at this hour, and his carry-on went in without trouble. He sat down. He arranged the contract documents he'd brought. A new fund, a new set of agreements, the ongoing work of a company that did not pause because one morning in October had redirected his attention. A flight attendant came through. A man named Bernard, according to his badge, silver-haired, the easy competence of someone with long experience. He offered the pre-departure beverage selection with the brief, comfortable efficiency of someone who did not need to think about how to do this part. Water, please, Gavin said. Thank you. Of course, Bernard said, and moved on. The water came. The plane filled. The door closed. Captain, a different one this time, a man named Rodriguez, came over the intercom with the standard departure briefing, clear and unhurried. The plane pushed back at 7:18. 3 minutes late, which was well within acceptable range. Gavin looked out the window as the aircraft taxied away from the gate, through the maze of taxiways toward the runway. The sky was the high pale blue of early December in Texas. Thin and clear. The kind of sky that doesn't commit to warmth, but doesn't apologize for it either. The runway stretched ahead, clear and open. He thought about Maya, who was at school right now, probably in math, probably not enjoying fractions. He thought about Mrs. Abernathy's soup with the too much dill. He thought about the oak tree in the backyard that needed its lower branches trimmed before spring, and the gate latch, and the pretzel bag he'd remembered to restock and left by the front door so he wouldn't forget it Thursday. He thought about a 68-page report and 9 recommendations and a man named Randall Voss who had asked his wife whether effectiveness and good leadership were the same thing and had been sitting with her answer. He thought about a teenager in 28D who had taken his headphones half off and had been thinking about it all morning. He thought about Rosario, wiping down tray tables in the quiet aftermath of something that had moved through the cabin and left the air different. I thought about what it costs to say a thing that needs to be said, and what it costs not to, and about how the second cost is the one that compounds, silently, quietly, in the bodies of the people who carry it, and in the systems that normalize it, and in the accumulated weight of all the moments when someone saw something and did the math and decided the cost of speaking was higher than the cost of staying quiet. He thought about a gray sweater and a boarding pass and 3 seconds in an aisle. He thought about Maya asking him, "And you fixed it?" And about his answer, "Working on it." That was still true. It would probably always be true, which was not a failure of resolution, but the honest shape of how things actually changed. Not in single moments of correction, but in the long, imperfect, ongoing work of the day after the moment and the day after that. The plane lifted off at 7:22. The runway fell away beneath them, and then the terminal, and then the whole spread of DFW with its arteries of taxiway and its ranked planes and its ordinary enormous machinery of people in transit, going somewhere, coming from somewhere, carrying the full weight of their lives in carry-on bags and underseat personal items, every one of them with a valid ticket to somewhere, every one of them entitled to the basic dignity of being seen clearly. The wheels came up. The aircraft climbed. Below, the city receded. The highway grids, the subdivisions, the water towers, the particular orderly geometry of human settlement that looks so rational from altitude and is so complicated at ground level. He watched it until the clouds came and it disappeared beneath the white, and then he turned from the window and picked up his contracts and got to work. He arrived in Chicago on time. There was no announcement, no interview, no statement about lessons learned or character revealed. He came out of the jetway into O'Hare the way people come out of jetways, with a carry-on and a direction and somewhere to be. He found a car waiting at arrivals, told the driver the address on West Monroe, and sat in the back seat with the contracts in his lap for the 40 minutes it took to get downtown in Thursday morning traffic, which was significant because Chicago traffic did not arrange itself differently for anyone. At 11 o'clock, he was in the conference room on the 31st floor, shaking hands with two founders who were 27 and 29, and had built a logistics software company that was doing something interesting with last-mile routing, and who were nervous in the specific way of young people who are very good at what they do and are slightly terrified of the room they've worked hard to get into. He poured himself water. He set his contracts on the table. He looked at the two of them, 27 and 29, at the beginning of something, dressed in clothes that suggested they had spent some time wondering what you wore to this kind of meeting and had made their best guess. "Tell me about the problem you're solving," he said. "Not the pitch version, the real version. What made you decide this was worth building?" The younger one, 27, she had red hair and a nervous habit of touching the pen she'd brought even when she wasn't writing, took a breath, and started talking. He listened. That was the thing, in the end, that never changed. The fundamental act of actually listening to the person in front of you, as opposed to the person you'd already decided they were before they opened their mouth. It cost almost nothing, and it changed almost everything, and it was not a skill you mastered once and kept. It was a practice. You had to keep choosing it, in boardrooms and airplane aisles and kitchen tables and doctors' waiting rooms and all the ordinary places where two people occupied the same space, and one of them decided, in 3 seconds or 30 years, what the other one was worth paying attention to. You had to keep choosing it. Gavin Mercer sat in a chair on the 31st floor of a building in Chicago, in a gray sweater with a coffee stain on the knee that had survived 4 washings and was probably permanent, and listened to a 27-year-old woman tell him the real version of something she'd built. Outside, the lake was flat and cold and enormous. The city went about its business. The world kept moving.